The hearing will come to order. Let me explain to folks that originally this hearing had been set for 10 o'clock today. It is our hope that somewhere around 10 o'clock we will have a quorum so that the Senate, so the Foreign Relations Committee can conduct its business meeting. We have some nominations, business to report out. So I hope colleagues and their staffs particularly can ensure that, or if we aim for 10 o'clock, it can be a very, very minimalist requirement on everybody's time. Meanwhile, we will go into the substance of today's hearing, the second in a series of hearings that we're going to have with respect to Afghanistan. Yesterday was the first hearing. We heard three compelling cases, each of them making strong arguments individually for how America should proceed. And the prescriptions ranged from dramatically reducing the footprint to expanding our commitment of troops and money to a level that would basically constitute pretty significant nation building. John Nagel, a co-author of the military's counterinsurgency manual, worked very closely with General Petraeus, argued that victory could require as many as, according to the field manual for standard counterinsurgency operations, 600,000 troops and a commitment of at least 5 years. The bulk of those troops, up to 400,000, would eventually be Afghan, but it was clear and stated that U.S. forces would be needed for years as trainers, as combat mentors, in order to fill the security gap before the Afghans were able to take over. Stephen Biddle argued that the benefits of a stepped-up counterinsurgency campaign outweighed the costs, but that it was a very close call. He acknowledged both the need for more troops and the genuine possibility of failure, even if we do up the ante. In his view, there could be no effective counterterrorism without an effective counterinsurgency, and he agreed with Dr. Nagel about the need for significant U.S. military involvement in Afghanistan to help prevent the destabilization of the country, of Pakistan. Finally, Rory Stewart challenged key assumptions of the administration's policy. Instead of escalation, he recommended that we maintain a small counterterrorism capacity to deny a safe haven to al-Qaeda and continue providing development aid on a low-key but long-term basis. He argued that we need not physically block al-Qaeda from returning to Afghanistan. We just have to keep Afghanistan from providing al-Qaeda with conditions of security and operational ease that they couldn't get in Pakistan, Somalia, Yemen, or elsewhere. He argued that Pakistan would stand or fall on its own, regardless of events across the border. Listening to these distinguished experts argue their cases, and listening to the important and I think very penetrating questions of my colleagues, it was obvious that there are fundamental disagreements that need to be resolved in order to try to build a consensus around a policy for going forward in Afghanistan. Despite the differences, I believe there are some central truths on which we can all agree. First, we need a winning civilian strategy. I've said repeatedly that we will not force the surrender of the Taliban by military force alone. Therefore, any strategy that lacks a strong civilian component is doomed. Second, our greatest national priority here is to ensure that Afghanistan does not destabilize Pakistan. As we debate how to succeed in Afghanistan, we must evaluate the impact of every decision on our beleaguered allies in Islamabad. But history tells us that the challenge is not only from the east. Afghanistan shares a 1,300-mile northern border with Central Asian countries that have suffered from instability themselves. Iran and Russia also have vested interests in Afghanistan. Unless we find common ground with them, I would think that we will continue competing instead of cooperating. Third, we need to counter the growing narcotics problem. As we described in a committee report released last month, senior military and civilian officials believe it will be extremely difficult to defeat the Taliban and establish good government without disrupting Afghanistan's opium trade. Afghanistan supplies more than 90% of the world's heroin and generates about $3 billion a year in profits, money that helps to finance the Taliban and other militant groups. We need to be realistic and pragmatic. Unlike Iraq, Afghanistan is not a reconstruction project. It is a construction project. Project in one of the poorest and most corrupt countries in the world. We have to come up with concrete goals and be clear about what and how much we are prepared to do to achieve them. I might add, there may well be a fourth thing on which we can agree, and that is that the problem of governance may even be in fact more serious than the challenge of the Taliban. And many people suggest, and I'm not sure it isn't now becoming more clear, that the absence of governance, the inadequacy of governance, the corruption of the governance in Afghanistan is perhaps one of the most demoralizing and defeating components of what may drive some people to the Taliban or elsewhere. And that is something we need to address. Today we welcome 4 witnesses who will take us deeper into this debate by sharing their ideas for what should change on the ground in order to succeed in Afghanistan. I might say 3 of them have traveled a very long distance, and we are very, very appreciative. The Honorable Ambassador Ryan Crocker flew from the West Coast to be here just for this, and General Craddock drove all the way up from North Carolina to be here, and I'm not sure of everybody else's travel arrangements, but we're enormously appreciative for everybody being here. We're going to hear from General Craddock first. He was the Supreme Allied Commander, Europe, until a couple of months ago when he retired from the Army. He will be followed by Ambassador Ryan Crocker, our former ambassador to Iraq and Pakistan, and Chargé in Kabul. And there are probably very few people who have as much understanding and experience in this region and in these challenges as Ambassador Crocker. Dr. Claire Lockhart, the co-author of Fixing Failed States and a former advisor to the Afghan government, will discuss her recommendations for a successful civilian strategy. And finally, Dr. Khaled Hosseini, the well-known author of The Kite Runner and 1,000 Splendid Suns, who has just returned from Afghanistan as UN Special Envoy for Refugee Issues. And we're delighted that each of you could be here with us today. Thank you. Senator Lugar.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Since President Obama's inauguration, his administration has taken a series of steps to reorder American foreign policy priorities. The President identified the war in Afghanistan as his administration's highest combat priority and has thus shifted emphasis and resources from Iraq to Afghanistan and Operation Enduring Freedom. He argued that the United States' effort in Afghanistan had been neglected in favor of our intervention in Iraq. President Obama made an important effort to sustain continuity of command and control of our Defense Department at the highest levels by retaining an effective and respected Secretary of Defense and promoting General Petraeus from Commander of U.S. Forces in Iraq to Commander of Central Command, where he heads our military efforts across the region. Both men have identified civil-military coordination as essential for progress toward U.S. goals in the region. At a more operational level, President Obama named Ambassador Richard Holbrooke as Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. He leads our strategic engagement with the governments of the region, while our able ambassadors, Ann Patterson in Pakistan and Carl Eikenberry in Afghanistan, work tirelessly in carrying out their respective duties. The U.S. diplomatic effort is joined in cause by Admiral Mike Mullen, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, beyond his responsibility for assuring the fitness and readiness of our fighting forces worldwide. He is closely engaged in the delicate and essential security discussions across South Asia. In his many visits to Pakistan, India, and Afghanistan, Admiral Mullen has worked to forge a closer, more confident relationship between our government and each of theirs. These leaders are seized of our commitment to Afghanistan and Pakistan and strengthening the foundations for stability. They, along with Secretary of State Clinton, National Security Advisor James Jones, and Vice President Biden, are together in the final stages of a crucial review of our strategies and policies in the region. But the President is the Commander-in-Chief, and he is the one who will make the final choices from the options he has presented. It is widely hoped that he will produce a coherent operational strategy for United States engagement in Afghanistan. Such an integrated strategy has yet to be unveiled, despite the many high and low-level reviews, and none has been described by the President with the force and conviction necessary to persuade the American people to endorse what will likely be a much longer, albeit necessary, commitment to achieve stability in the region. As he formulates his new strategy, I strongly urge the President to make a concerted effort to work personally with the Congress, which will control the purse strings for our endeavors in the region. We in Congress have heard of general outlines of an approach to the region, highlighted by the President and his senior advisors in March of this year, namely that we intend to, quote, disrupt, dismantle, and defeat, end of quote, al-Qaeda and their allies. We have also received extensive requests and notifications through several supplemental appropriations and the fiscal year 2010 budget requests, identifying billions of dollars in assistance and operations funding for Afghanistan and the region. But many questions have arisen surrounding troop levels, civilian force levels, and contractor roles and behavior. And considering the important role of development for the region, I'm troubled that there is still no USAID administrator. As a member of both this committee and the Agriculture Committee, I'm concerned about reports that $170 million in USAID money will be transferred to the Department of Agriculture to develop an expeditionary agricultural development capacity for Afghanistan. This, I believe, is normally the job of USAID. For the moment, the committee has been informed that General McChrystal's suggestions for future strategy and tactics are being studied in the administration. We are led to believe that after the administration has studied the McChrystal report for an indefinite period of time, the General may suggest appropriate troop levels for the United States and our NATO allies necessary to achieve the administration's final decision on objectives. The committee hearings this week offered the administration an opportunity to explain the challenges and difficult decisions to be made after nearly a year of study. Invitations were issued, but they were declined. Thus, we have turned today to key actors and former officials experienced in government, war zones, Afghanistan, and the region to provide their insight and recommendations. And we are deeply grateful they have accepted our invitation to present timely information to our committee and to all Americans in an extensively covered public forum. I hope that the administration will soon decide on the time for its views to reach the American people. In any event, it is critical that the full force and voice of the President lead the discussion around this national strategic priority with so many American lives and hundreds of billions of dollars at stake. Only he can lay the foundation that will gain the confidence of Congress and our soldiers, our development experts, our diplomats, and our partners. I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Lugar. We're going to begin with General Craddock and run right across the table. So, General, if you would be good enough, your full testimonies will be placed in the record as if read in full. So if you could summarize in approximately 5 minutes or so, it'd be helpful, and then we can have more time for discussion.
Chairman Kerry, Ranking Member Lugar.
Let me just comment, we need 5 more senators if we can get them here for the quorum, and we're in good shape. Thank you, General.
Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you here today. I think the focus of this hearing, Afghanistan, is important, timely, and essential. As I've been requested to provide insight on the counter-narcotics efforts in Afghanistan, I will focus my short opening remarks in that area. Before exploring the counter-narcotics challenge, I would like to emphasize that the NATO commitment to Afghanistan as an alliance is strong. I would also point out that the commitment differs among individual NATO members. Continued United States leadership in this mission is essential to both deepen the level of support of NATO and to ensure continued participation of all alliance members. With regard to the issue of counter-narcotics in Afghanistan, may I preface my comments and responses to your later questions with the understanding that my perspective is from my last assignment on active duty with the United States Armed Forces, that of the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, a NATO perspective. In October 2006, NATO assumed responsibility for security for the entire country of Afghanistan. The authority to do so was provided to the Supreme Allied Commander by the North Atlantic Council. The means of granting that authority was through the Council's approval of the NATO Military Operations Plan for Afghanistan. The Strategic Operations Plan contains specific instructions to all subordinate commands responsible for conducting operations in Afghanistan concerning counter-narcotics operations. Specifically, NATO forces were not to conduct counter-narcotics operations or activities to include eradication of poppy crops. What was permitted was support to the Afghan counter-narcotics forces, support in terms of information, intelligence, logistic support, and, if required, in extremis support and medical support for Afghan counter-narcotics forces, all upon request by those forces. In February 2007, the current intelligence assessments, discussions with Afghan authorities, and consultations with the United Kingdom and the United States counter-narcotics authorities all combined to establish a strong link between the narcotics traffickers and the Afghan insurgents, particularly the Taliban. A growing body of evidence indicated that much of the funding of the Taliban insurgency was being generated by the narcotics industry in Afghanistan. UN experts estimated upwards of 200 million narco dollars going into insurgent coffers. It was at that point, as the strategic commander, I began to urge for the approval of additional authorities for NATO forces in Afghanistan to conduct operations against both narcotics facilities and facilitators. Our assessment was that reducing the money available to the insurgents would make it more difficult for them to hire soldiers, pay bomb and improvised explosive device, the IED makers, and buy weapons and materiel. All were essential in reducing the level of violence and providing enhanced security. And it was not until November of 2008, some 18 months later, that NATO, via a defense ministerial meeting, approved these additional authorities. The ministers concluded the preponderance of evidence to that date supported the assessments that the narco-traffickers were providing support to the insurgency. Subsequent guidance and orders were issued, and NATO forces began using these expanded authorities. As of mid-June this year, some 25 counter-narcotics operations have been conducted, either by NATO forces alone or in conjunction with Afghan counter-narcotics forces, with favorable results. Many processing facilities, the laboratories, have been destroyed, precursor material confiscated and destroyed, opium paste and refined heroin confiscated, and personnel apprehended. While much has been accomplished, much more remains to be done. First and foremost, NATO, ISAF forces must continue to conduct operations against the facilities and the facilitators, not only to reduce the money available to the insurgents, but also with the secondary effect of reducing the level of corruption countrywide. Secondly, NATO and NATO member nations, on a bilateral basis, must continue to partner and support the development of the Afghan security and counter-narcotics forces. The end state for this effort are fully competent, capable Afghan security forces that minimize the impact of narcotics on the Afghan society. Once again, thank you for this opportunity to appear before this committee, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, General Craddock. Ambassador Crocker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Lugar, members of the committee, it's an honor to be before you today. I have had that honor a number of occasions in the past as a witness for the administration. Today is the first time I can honestly say that in addition to it being an honor, it's also a pleasure. Mr. Chairman, Afghanistan is a critical national security interest for the United States, for the region, and for the international community. General Craddock has addressed some of the NATO perspective. I would comment briefly on a regional perspective, focusing particularly on Pakistan, where I was ambassador from 2004 to 2007, and Iran, where I was involved in direct discussions with the Iranians on Afghanistan from 2001 to 2003. Mr. Chairman, as you know so well, our relationship with Pakistan is vital for our nation's national security as well as for stability in Afghanistan. We were closely allied with Pakistan in the effort to force the Soviets out of Afghanistan in the 1980s. But once the Soviets were out, so were we. And Pakistan went from being the most allied of allies to being a sanctioned pariah. After 9/11, we are back. Pakistanis welcome that renewed engagement, but they ask again for how long. We have an urgent need to build a stable, sustained relationship with Pakistan. And Mr. Chairman, you, Senator Lugar, and this committee have shown the way through your sponsorship of the Enhanced Partnership with Pakistan Act. It's precisely the type of long-term undertaking both our nations need. Pakistan today faces an interrelated set of insurgencies, Kashmiri militants to the east, al-Qaeda and Taliban to the west, and an internal insurgency that targets Pakistan's principal cities. It can be argued that much of this insurgency is of Pakistan's own making, but there is also a Pakistani narrative that says in the case of support for the Taliban, they had no choice after we withdrew in the 1990s. Mr. Chairman, during my time in Pakistan, I came to know a large number of mainstream political figures and senior military officers. None of them share the Taliban's vision for Pakistan and Afghanistan. Yet many remain uncertain over the long-term prospects for our relationship. We need to learn from our past experience and build for a better future, and your legislation, Mr. Chairman, shows us all the way. Afghanistan's western neighbor, Iran, poses a very different set of challenges. The multiple differences between the United States and Iran need no elaboration from me. On Afghanistan, however, we have at times found room for cooperation. In the wake of 9/11, when I sat down with Iranians under UN auspices, I found them fully supportive of U.S. military action to bring down the Taliban. U.S.-Iranian agreement on the Afghan Interim Authority was at the core of the success of the UN-sponsored Bonn Conference. And after I reopened our embassy in Kabul in January 2002, we discussed with the Iranians, again under UN auspices, ways to strengthen the interim administration and to reduce the power of warlords. The Iranians hedged their bets, however, also providing sanctuary for al-Qaeda figures later implicated in attacks in the Arabian Peninsula that brought to an effective end that dialogue with Iran. Mr. Chairman, the administration has stated its willingness to engage in a dialogue with the Iranians. I think this is a positive step. I certainly support it. And I hope Afghanistan will be on the agenda, that the Iranians will take a strategic look at their own interests, because I think those interests also lie in a stable Afghanistan. Mr. Chairman, I would offer just a couple of thoughts based on my experience in Iraq. And one must be careful, as you note, not to draw too many parallels. Construction in Afghanistan, reconstruction in Iraq, I think is a very good point. It is going to be very hard in Afghanistan. That does not mean hopeless. We have some very fine people in the fight. General McChrystal, Ambassador Eikenberry in Afghanistan, Ambassador Patterson in Pakistan, and my old comrade from Baghdad, General Petraeus, now overseeing both wars, I think can give all Americans confidence that the right people are in the right place. It is the President, as Senator Lugar said, who must show the way. When he does, I hope that this committee and counterparts in the Senate and the House will seek from my former colleagues that irreplaceable perspective, which is the view from the field. The stakes are very high indeed in Afghanistan, and Mr. Chairman, I think all of us in America are indebted to you and the committee for helping us illuminate these issues. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. I don't think I did justice in introducing you to the outstanding service that you provided us in Iraq and in Pakistan and through your career, and we're very, very grateful. I know how much value two presidents had in your advice, and we're very grateful to you. Ms. Lockhart, I think we have two senators?
Two more, one's on the way.
Okay. We're two senators away from an interruption.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Lugo, members of the committee, Mr. Chairman, Senator Lugo, members of the committee, I thank you for the opportunity to address you. There is now an emerging recognition that there is no purely military resolution to the situation in Afghanistan, and that governance and development are as, if not more, important tools. I believe that the establishment of Afghan sovereignty, by which I mean enabling Afghans to exercise self-rule through Afghan institutions that can provide their own security, governance, and revenue-raising capability, provides the framework that we need. And it will provide, first, a means of stabilizing Afghanistan and critically denying space for the Taliban, who, as Senator Kerry recognized, derive their strength primarily from the weakness of Afghan institutions. Second, it provides basis for an exit, an honorable exit for American forces and presence on the ground, or a transition strategy, if we don't want to call it an exit strategy. And third, it demonstrates to the Afghan population that the US and allied presence is not an occupation. It's not an occupation at all, nor is it an open-ended occupation. The military have now articulated a clear strategy for building up the Afghan security forces and protecting the population. And I believe we now need a similar articulation of a strategy for governance and development that matches the one the military has put forward in rigor and detail. First, I'd like to reflect on the mistakes made. I think that over the last years, we have not had a clear strategy for the civilian component, for governance and development. Afghan institutions have been catastrophically under-resourced. When I was on the ground in Afghanistan between 2001 and 2005, the first Afghan budget for a civil service that had 240,000 civil servants in 2002 was resourced to the level of $20 million. And this was enough to pay fuel for a month, but not to pay the doctors, teachers, and policemen even salaries of $50 a month. And much activity from the aid system has been counterproductive. The provision of billions of dollars with very little accountability, particularly to UN agencies and NGOs, not underestimating the great work that many UN agencies have done. And from the perspective of an Afghan citizen with no hope for a job or education, there has been little outlet but to join the narcotics industry or sign up with the Taliban in many parts of the country. Moving forwards, I think the first question to address is, what does good enough governance look like? The first component is certainly security, building up the Afghan National Army, the police force, the Afghan intelligence services, and justice institutions, law enforcement institutions. But security institutions alone won't make an Afghan government capable of exercising authority and maintaining stability in the country that will allow the drawdown. It requires, in my view, three other components. The first of these is rule of law. The decision-making institutions across the cabinet and across the levels of Afghan governance, the capital city Kabul, but at province level, district level, municipalities and villages. The second component is public finance. We hear a lot about corruption, and I think we need to take a clear-headed look at the other side of that coin. How do we build the systems of accountability in revenue raising and public expenditure that will allow Afghanistan to raise its own revenue and expend its own resources on its institutions for the decades to come? And the third component is basic services. And we're not talking here about a Valhalla or a Switzerland, but the basic services at the village level in irrigation to allow for agriculture, livelihoods, health and education that will allow Afghans to live lives with dignity. And this will require investment in education. Another critical lacuna has been only to educate Afghans up to the age of 11. And if one only educates up to the age of 11, we're not going to have a civil service or a market economy capable of being self-sufficient. I think we have grounds for optimism. I question the myth of Afghanistan as an inherently corrupt culture full of warlords. There is an Afghan demand for rule of law rooted in their culture. There was a reasonable standard of governance in the middle decades of the 20th century. When I arrived in Kabul, there were 240,000 civil servants in place across the country, administering the country fairly well. I think the culture of corruption has been one that's been allowed to fester in recent decades, but is not of the culture. And finally, there was a series of successes between 2001 and 2005, where a political framework articulated through Bonn allowed for a number of governance initiatives to be successful, most notably the creation of the Afghan National Army from scratch, and a number of national programs, including the National Solidarity Program that saw block grants issued to every village in the country, now across 23,000 villages, that allows villages to maintain their own affairs. I think we also have grounds for pessimism. There is a legacy of decades of war and a lost generation. And corruption was allowed to set in at the heart of government institutions. Back in 2004, the group of us who were assisting the government realized that it was probably inevitable that this corruption would continue to fester and allow the country to fall back to the Taliban. I don't think this was inevitable, and I don't think it's too late to put it right. I'll conclude with some short reflections on the emerging strategy.
One more.
I think we can be encouraged to see that there is a strategy emerging from Kabul under the leadership of Ambassador Eikenberry and his excellent team, and in coordination with General McChrystal, to put in place a strategy that will support the creation of the adequate and necessary Afghan institutions. And I think this is balanced with understanding that we can't just focus on state institutions, we must also allow the space for Afghan civil society to hold that government accountable and invest in market institutions to create, in the short term, jobs that will pull people away from illicit activities, and over the medium term lay the basis for an economy that will make Afghanistan self-sufficient. And I think we face two immediate challenges. Very sadly, the elections recently held did not renew the governance settlement in the country. And this is tragic, I think, because it was avoidable. And I do think some questions need to be asked of the way that the election was managed by the UN so that those mistakes can be avoided in future in Afghanistan and in other countries. But we now face a paradox because the coin strategy requires there to be a host nation government with a vision that the people can sign up to. And that government is not yet in place. I think we have different options for how a government that is good enough can be put in place. And once that political settlement is in place that will allow for the process of reconciliation with groups across the country, then I think the second key need is to articulate the governance and development strategy that is necessary. It is possible to put it in place, and then it must be resourced with the adequate resources that have been so sorely missing the last few years. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lockhart. Important point of view, and I'm confident people will want to follow up on it. Dr. Hosseini, again, thank you very, very much for being with us and sharing your very important and on-the-ground vision here. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, on behalf of the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, I would like to express my appreciation for this opportunity to appear before you and to offer my perspectives and concerns on the Afghan refugee situation and the overall conditions in Afghanistan. In way of background, UNHCR currently has 12 offices inside Afghanistan, and it's had a presence in Afghanistan since the late 1980s and maintained an office in Afghanistan during the Taliban rule in the 1990s. At the peak of the Afghan displacement crisis in the mid-1990s, some 8 million Afghans fled home and went to neighboring Pakistan and Iran. And after the fall of the
Dr.
Taliban...
Hosseini, can I interrupt you for a moment?
Certainly.
Because I want to take advantage of the fact that we have a quorum of the committee here. And I promised some colleagues we'd make that part of the meeting brief, so thank you for letting me interrupt. And if the record could perhaps not reflect the interruption, we could do that. So we'll move to a business meeting, it is to consider 6 nominees. Very briefly, they are Michael Posner to be Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights and Labor, Robert Hormats to be Undersecretary of State for Economic, Energy and Agricultural Affairs, and, Undersecretary of State, yes, Economic, Energy and Agricultural Affairs, and to be the U.S. alternate governor to to several international financial institutions, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development for a term of 5 years, United States alternate governor of the Inter-American Development Bank for a term of 5 years, United States alternate governor of the African Development Bank for a term of 5 years, United States alternate governor of the African Development Fund, United States alternate governor of the Asian Development Bank, and the United States alternate governor of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Then David Jacobson to be ambassador to Canada, Alan Solomon to be ambassador to Spain and Andorra, Barry White to be ambassador to Norway, and Lee Feinstein to be ambassador to Poland. I am unaware of any request for a roll call vote, so if there is a motion...
If I could just put a statement in the record on the nomination of Robert Hormats.
Without objection,
Thank you, Mr.
that statement will be placed in the record.
Move the adoption of the list, Mr.
The adoption is moved. Is there a second? Seconded. Senator Kaufman. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. The ayes have it. The nominees are approved from the committee and will be reported to the floor. Is there any further business to come before the committee? If not, with respect to the business meeting, we will return to the hearing. Thank you all for helping to get the quorum here. Dr. Hosseini, if you would pick up where you left off, we appreciate it. And as I said, the record will not reflect an interruption.
Certainly. After the fall of the Taliban in 2001, UNHCR began the largest repatriation operation in the history of the agency, repatriating since 2002 some 5 million Afghans. UNHCR also has offices in Iran and Pakistan through which it assists some 2.6 million Afghan refugees who have yet to return home. I came back yesterday from a 5-day trip to Afghanistan where I met with ordinary Afghans, where I met with refugees, displaced people, aid workers and officials. And I'll focus my comments today first on the needs of the Afghan refugees, particularly those who have recently returned to Afghanistan from neighboring countries, and then on the needs of the Afghan people in general. On the issue of refugees, some have reintegrated successfully and have resumed relatively settled lives, but many that I met continue to struggle. It has been a major challenge, to say the least, for many returnees to restart their lives in a country where basic services have collapsed. Some of the returnees that I met last week lived in squalid, abandoned public buildings, or in tents, or on government land in dry, remote, and inaccessible areas. They complained to me of the lack of basic services like water, food, schools, clinics, and most importantly, jobs. Some had a great fear of the coming winter. Given these difficult realities, maybe it's not surprising that 2.6 million Afghans still live in exile in Iran and Pakistan. 80% of them have lived there for more than 2 decades, and half of them were born there. And after 30 years of living in exile and given the difficult conditions inside Afghanistan and the state's low absorption capacity, many of them may not wish to ever come home. It is important, however, that return and reintegration be made as attractive as possible to Afghan refugees. And for that to happen, existing conditions inside Afghanistan have to be remedied, so the environment within the country is more conducive to the social and economic well-being of refugees. That means Afghan authorities, in partnership with international community, have to work on critical pull factors like security, employment opportunity, access to land, water, shelter, education, and health facilities in order for repatriation to become a more attractive option and for refugees to become self-sufficient and reintegrate successfully. The needs of returning refugees and IDPs have to be included in national programs. UNHCR can help, but its expertise lies in emergency response and in legal, physical, and material protection. As part of the initial reintegration process, UNHCR provides shelter, water, transport, and family grants. But returning refugees need more. They need security, they need stability, they need economic and social opportunities. And though UNHCR can certainly act as a partner and as an advocate for these needs, it cannot provide them, and it has to rely on reconstruction and development partners to create the socioeconomic conditions and opportunities that are required for durable return. And so to that end, donor support and continued engagement of the international community is indispensable. On a broader front, let me say that Afghanistan has been in a state of conflict for almost 30 years. The country and its population made huge sacrifices during the Soviet occupation. Every family that I met and that I spoke to had been touched by tragedy. Tragedy on a scale that few of us here can imagine. Many Afghans believe that the violent that the final and violent chapter of the Cold War was inked with their blood. Today, my impression is that Afghanistan faces yet another critical and pivotal moment in its recent unstable history. I believe there's an opportunity in Afghanistan, an opportunity to build on the progresses that have been made since 2002. And despite the sobering realities, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that there has been progress. For instance, 6 million children are enrolled in some 9,000 schools around the country. Afghans have greater access to the health sector. Millions of kids have been vaccinated. Commerce and enterprise inside Kabul are appreciably increased. Infrastructure is booming, and technology, especially telecommunication, appears poised to leapfrog Afghan business development. There's free press and greater personal freedom. But progress hasn't been fast enough or deep enough, and all of us would like to see it reach more Afghans. And there are many challenges that can undermine the progress that we have seen. The decline in refugee repatriation this year, for instance, is an indicator that security remains a major obstacle and that the economy has not grown quickly enough, especially in rural areas. Afghanistan remains one of the poorest countries in the world. Poverty, in fact, is the #1 killer in Afghanistan. Average life expectancy is one of the lowest in the world. 25,000 plus women die every year during childbirth. That's more deaths than those caused by all the suicide bombs, IEDs, and airstrikes combined. And though historically there is no tradition of extremism in Afghanistan, poverty can make people, especially unemployed, aimless young people, more vulnerable to exploitation by extremist groups. Military intervention is an important part of counterinsurgency, but it's only part of it. Counterinsurgency has to include social and economic intervention as well. When people have a roof over their head, food on the table, and a school to send their kids to, they're less likely to be influenced by extremist voices. These are huge challenges to be addressed, and they shouldn't be minimized. During my visit, all the Afghans that I encountered expressed their concerns about the future and some disappointment about the present. They clearly expected more from their government, but none of them wanted to go back to the past. And I see no reason why we should allow ourselves to be defeatists and let the country slide back towards its troubled past. The Afghan people don't want the moon, and we should secure the modest levels of improvements in people's lives that would earn us such goodwill and make such a difference in Afghanistan's stability. There are opportunities to be seized, and if all parties accept their responsibilities, that begins first and foremost with the Afghans themselves. They have to do their part. This is their country, after all. Afghan leaders have to acknowledge that their people expect more from them, and rightfully so. They have to restore people's faith in governmental institutions. But I stress this, that the international community, for its part, must maintain its continued support for the Afghan people, and it has to be patient. I'm aware of the current debate in this country about the Afghan war, and I feel deep empathy for the families who have lost loved ones in Afghanistan. I know I speak for most Afghans when I say how grateful Afghans are for their service and sacrifice. And contrary to what some have said, Afghans are not an ungrateful people. But let's not let the sacrifices of our service people, men and women, be in vain. And let's be patient. Let's consider that no country in history has been able to establish a functioning state, a performing government, a strong economy, and a stable society in just a handful of years. Afghans are a proud people, and they don't want to be a source of regional and international instability. They don't want to be known for producing refugees and economic migrants around the world. They want no more or no less than other people in developing countries want for their children and themselves. If the basic essentials can be provided, housing, education, and healthcare, I truly believe that this closure can be brought to this dark chapter of the country's recent history. Mr. Chairman, I again appreciate the opportunity to testify before you, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you or the members of the committee may have. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you all of you for helping to set the stage. There are a lot of questions that flow out of your testimonies, and I'm confident that colleagues here will pursue them. What's interesting to me is I was sitting here thinking, I was listening to your testimony, Dr. Hosseini, and to you, Ms. Lockhart, both of you describing, obviously, an urgent humanitarian need, an urgent challenge in terms of nation building, state building, challenge of governance. On the other hand, we've had troops on the ground, and we have been in Afghanistan for 8 years now. We're nearing the 8-year anniversary right now. And the test for us in terms of policy, I mean, if you took away the al-Qaeda and you took away the attacks, there would be a challenge to us as to what our foreign policy aid program ought to be and what the levels of assistance we might give are. But right now, our challenge is also to try to figure out what the level of military involvement, troop involvement ought to be, indeed, what our security interests are, and how they can be furthered with respect to Afghanistan. The President of the United States has defined the mission in a more limited fashion, really, by saying that our goal is to take on al-Qaeda, dismantle them, and or eliminate them, and to prevent them from having a safe haven and a sanctuary from which they can attack the United States, and to prevent the destabilization of Pakistan, where we have an even larger, more vital interest. So the test for us here, as we think about our policy going forward, and we need to ask you questions about the nation building and the relationship of it to those interests. But the key here is really to try to hone in, I think, on those interests and how we best serve them. One of the essential questions we need to get at, I think, Ambassador Crocker, you can perhaps help us do that, is sort of, you know, while you were there for a period of time, the Pakistanis proved themselves capable of living pretty comfortably with a pretty full Taliban regime. It didn't end Pakistan's capacity to govern. It didn't threaten them existentially. Now, today, that's changed a little bit, obviously, because of the Haqqani network, the Bayt al-Masud network, the presence of al-Qaeda and other things. But the question for us, and I want to ask you to begin here, is help us to understand, define for us what the real impact of the Taliban is today and might be on the stability of Pakistan. And would it, in fact, be an existential challenge to them if the Taliban took over in Afghanistan today?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That is indeed a key question. And as you rightly point out, we've seen an evolution. During the 1990s, Pakistan did indeed work out a modus vivendi with a Taliban-led government in Afghanistan and had relative stability at home. But that has changed. We have seen the evidence. You point to the Haqqani network, the efforts of the now late Bayt al-Masud, the developments in the Swat Valley. We have seen an increasing militancy within Pakistan, not restricted just to the border areas, that is growing to the point where, for many Pakistanis, it does raise at least the question of an existential threat. Now, I think there are other questions in Pakistan, again, about our staying power, that still cause some hedging of bets there. The ultimate nightmare in Pakistan would be to see us once again decide we're done. We're done in Afghanistan, and we're done in Pakistan, a repeat of the 1990s, leaving them with what by that point may be a truly dangerous enemy. So,
can I just interrupt you for a moment there? I don't think, I mean, let me make it clear from my point of view, Senator Lugar's point of view, I think the committee, there's no talk here, and I don't want anybody even beginning to think that there is a contemplation of not being committed to Pakistan or of understanding the challenge of Pakistan. And the legislation we passed, which you referred to, states that commitment, and we understand the importance of Pakistan. There's no talk of diminishing that. What the question really begs is this, is to what degree is Afghanistan, in fact, left to its own devices or with a lesser footprint at jeopardy? Are our interests, in fact, challenged if we had a different approach to Afghanistan?
I think they would be challenged. Simply put, Mr. Chairman, I see a reciprocity here. I don't think long-term stability can be brought to Afghanistan without Pakistan also stabilizing. But the reverse is also true. I don't think that Pakistan can face up to the challenges of militancy, not just on its western borders, but in the center of the country, if that militancy succeeds in Afghanistan. We all know the history of the Durand Line, its porosity, its artificial nature. There are more Pashtuns in Pakistan than there are in Afghanistan. So a militant ascendancy in Afghanistan, I think, will be severely destabilizing for Pakistan.
And is there any degree, yesterday it was suggested by Rory Stewart that perhaps the presence of troops and the manner of the mission in Afghanistan is to some degree destabilizing Pakistan, that it's adding to the capacity, coupled with the corruption of the governance, it's adding to this ability of the Taliban to kind of, find recruits and make mischief.
My experience is now somewhat dated. I left Pakistan in 2007, but as of that time, I knew of no senior Pakistani figure, military or civilian, who was advocating a U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. There was lots of criticism over how well we were prosecuting the mission, but it was taken as a given in my contacts there that mission needed to be prosecuted, perhaps in better or different ways, but that we needed to stay engaged there.
Well, I'm not suggesting, I think just a plain old withdrawal would be disastrous on any number of different fronts. I think what we're trying to figure out is how to accomplish the mission, what level of mix of military and governance, improvement, and nation building, et cetera, is appropriate. I think some people are very fearful that right now there's sort of this nondescript, loosey-goosey, we got to do this here and do this here and build this, and we're going to train the military, we're going to do this and that. And we heard yesterday that to properly effect a counterinsurgency, which has grown, the Taliban are now in control of 37% of the country, whereas a year ago they were in control of 20-something%. And that growth, has to make you pause and say, okay, the western part, the northern part haven't yet reached it, but we heard fears expressed that may happen. Therefore, to be successful, you have to begin to think about what's the real troop ratio that you need to provide the security for adequate counterinsurgency. And counterinsurgency, we heard yesterday, is a distinctly different mission from counterterrorism. The mission, as I understood it from the President, was more counterterrorism in Afghanistan and stabilization with respect to Pakistan. So we've got to figure out if we're sort of, is there a automatic and unavoidable mission creep here, or is there an inadvertent mission creep here, or is there something in our automatic response to how we protect Pakistan that requires us to, sort of feel that you have to do the counterinsurgency. That's, I think, the biggest tension here, is what level of counterinsurgency do you need to support the counterterrorism effort and the destabilization piece. And we need to, obviously pursue it further. Senator Lugar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to explore for a moment this thought that the Chairman has mentioned, which came up in our hearing yesterday, that essentially one witness said the major reason why we ought to have stability in Afghanistan is to help perpetuate stability in Pakistan. That one reason for having troops in Afghanistan is simply because Pakistan has nuclear weapons. In the event that there was a disintegration of governance in Pakistan, various parts of the governance might take hold of the weapons, and that really is a threat then, well beyond anything we've discussed. If al-Qaeda or whatever the group may be gains control of warheads or other instruments that change the texture a great deal. This is sort of a turnaround from most of our discussions of Afghanistan, which we've looked at Afghanistan in terms of how villages could become more sufficient, how agriculture might rise, how the drug abuse might be curtailed, in essence, how more children could go to school and how women's rights would be fostered. And that's been the nature of many of these. To turn things around, that Afghanistan is important strategically to the United States because of Pakistan is a different twist. Now, furthermore, there have been discussions in the press, even as in the press today, that one of the problems may be stability in Afghanistan if the people do not accept President Karzai as their leader. It's not far-fetched. Some would say that given next door the problem in Iran, clearly the regime is still there, but there have been people in the street. People continue to go into the street. There is a situation in which, even with our government, as we want to have dialogue with Iran, as you've suggested, the question is being with whom, and if we reach agreement, how stable, given that situation. What I want, I suppose, from each of you is some idea of what is the stability of potential governance at the highest levels, quite apart from the regional levels and so forth, of Afghanistan. And in the event, let us say, as Europeans are quoted in the press today as saying a third of the votes for President Karzai, they have been invalid. Well, that is a very significant charge. And it suggests that the ballots that we heard yesterday that have been prepared for a runoff might be used. But then others say, well, now you don't understand. The weather gets bad. The difficulties of conducting an election are not the same in November as they are in the United States. And furthermore, the whole thing might get shifted into next year, in which somehow we're talking about stability now in Afghanistan, and when we were originally talking about how Afghanistan helps Pakistan remain stable. Now finally, in preface, people are saying Pakistan, all things considered, have been pretty stable this past year, despite predictions that President Zardari might have grave difficulties after 3 months. He seems to be sailing along. The one that we have to worry about maybe for stability is if Afghanistan. So no wonder perhaps the president says, okay, to his advisors, whoever he's talking to down there at the White House, we better hang on for a while before we get into a recommendation of troop levels, get into a national debate with the public opinion in this country that seems to have a different timeline. And what I'm wondering is if we're not kicking the can down the road even in our decision-making. And I did not want to be hypercritical in my opening statement, but I just observed that General McChrystal's report always seems to be there. We're going to discuss and discuss and discuss it and digest it, and all sorts of people look at it and so forth. And then suddenly we come along after an indefinite period and begin to talk about troop levels. Does anyone have any comment? General Craddock, do you have any thoughts about these ruminants that I have suggested?
Well, thank you, Senator Lugar. Indeed, it's a bit of a conundrum. There's no doubt. I think Senator Kerry's opening comment said this is not winnable by military means. Absolutely. I have said that for the past several years. The military, the security effort will set the conditions then for good enough governance, as Claire Lockhart said, for investment, for development, for the creation of jobs. As you go about the country, and I also go on about, it's about clean water, education, a job, electricity. How hard can that be? Obviously, it takes some security to do that. I think from the security perspective, and this is again a NATO perspective, security and stability, there are two fundamental issues there. One is the funding of the insurgency, whether it be the Taliban, Haig, Haqqani, whatever the case may be. And that's largely, and has been largely, it's down somewhat from the narcotics business, and it has to be addressed, and it continued to be addressed, and we have to take away the wherewithal, the contributions from that after the value is added, and that's in the processing from the raw opium paste into the heroin, and that's why the facilities are so important to be attacked.
General, let me interrupt that point, because many would allege that in addition to the insurgents getting the money, the government is getting the money. There are two great recipients.
And that That was in my opening statement, and indeed, it fuels the corruption. Now, I know that the numbers are down. Right now, the latest estimates, a $3 billion industry, of which some $1 billion stays in country, and $200 to $300 million to the insurgents. Where does the rest go? Corruption, private and public. Has to be addressed. But the security will only create the conditions then for what Rory Stewart says the Afghan people are morally bound to do for themselves, which is govern better.
Mm-hmm. So that's the basis for our security then.
It is.
Give a framework for Afghan people to progress.
I think it is protect the people, put an umbrella, a security umbrella around the municipalities, around the villages and towns so that there can be investment, development, jobs created, and when the people get that, they will push the insurgents out.
Well, my time is completed, but I appreciate that answer.
Thank you, Senator Lugar. Senator Feingold.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, for holding all these hearings on one of the most important questions facing our nation at this time, and we're honored to have all these distinguished witnesses here. These hearings have contributed to a much-needed debate regarding our efforts in Afghanistan, and while there may be disagreement on some issues, one point of consensus that has clearly emerged and that the Chairman just restated is that no one thinks we should abandon Afghanistan. The U.S. must remain engaged in helping the Afghan people resolve the many difficult issues facing their country through diplomatic means and through ongoing assistance. However, I do believe that we need to examine whether the current military strategy may potentially be counterproductive. I'm concerned that our massive military presence may be contributing to instability in the region and could be unwittingly undermining our chief national security priority, which is, of course, relentlessly pursuing al-Qaeda's global network. Helping the Afghan people build a stable nation for themselves is an important long-term goal. We must consider how best to achieve this and whether this requires a departure from our current overly military-centric approach. Pastor Crocker, Admiral Mullen and Special Envoy Holbrooke have acknowledged at these hearings that there is a danger that U.S. military operations in Afghanistan could drive militants into Pakistan and further destabilize that nuclear-armed country. And the DNI, Admiral Blair, has testified that, quote, no improvement in Afghanistan is possible without Pakistan taking control of its border areas and improving governance, creating economic and educational opportunities throughout the country. Do you agree that the key to preventing the spread of militancy in the Afghan-Pakistan border region is improved governance and effective counterterrorism in Pakistan as opposed to our military operations in Afghanistan?
Senator, I would certainly join General Craddock and I think most of the members in the strong view that there is no purely military solution to problems in Afghanistan or indeed in Pakistan. There is a military component to a broader solution. The military, and I apologize for treading in General Craddock's area, talks about troops to task. Defining the task, I think, is absolutely essential at this point. And again, Mr. Chairman, I commend the committee for its focus on this. What is it that we believe needs to be done to bring, as Ms. Lockhart puts it so well, good enough governance to Afghanistan, or to allow the Afghans that opportunity? That is where long-term stability will lie. The military then becomes a component of that. We need to define our goals, our end states, the milestones along the road to that end state, if you will, and then, but I think only then, can we really talk in a coherent way about force levels and force composition.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Hosseini, recent polls have shown the majority of Afghans oppose an increase in U.S. troops. Do you think there's a danger that our disregard for this preference could provoke more militancy?
I think there's no question that there's a shade of public opinion in Afghanistan that is beginning to see the security forces in Afghanistan as an occupation. My sense is that compared to a few years ago, there are more people now who view the security forces in a negative light. and the civilian casualties have a very, very significant impact on that public opinion. That said, on balance, I think most Afghans know that if the security forces were to leave, things would be a whole lot worse. And this is because they understand that the Afghan institutions and the Afghan security forces are not strong enough to assure the country and its people of a normal or even semi-normal state of existence. At the end of the day, any state has to exercise a monopoly over the legitimate use of force in the greater interest of the civilians at large, and the Afghan state at this point is not in the position to do that. So do the Afghans want foreign troops on their land? No. I mean, they would prefer that there not be. They're independent, sovereign people. But do they see it as a necessary thing still today? I think most Afghans would concede that point.
But as to the question of an increase in troops,
I think when you speak to Afghans on the ground, their fear is not more engagement. Their fear is that there will be less engagement. There is a fear of abandonment in Afghanistan. People have a very long memory, and they remember back to what happened at the end of the Soviet invasion, where, for whatever, as you can put it, we've decided that it was no longer in our strategic interest who ran Afghanistan. At this point, I think the Afghan concern is with less engagement, not with more engagement. That said, Afghans do have a concern with how troops do behave. That's not to say that they approve of everything. You take an 18-year-old from this country and send them to Afghanistan, and what seems like a rudimentary and poor and unsophisticated society is in fact very nuanced and sophisticated in the way in which customs, manners, speech, posture is transmitted and understood. So there's a steep learning curve for the troops there, but I think the current leadership is addressing that.
well, of course, I have tremendous respect for your knowledge and views on this. All I can say for the record is that these polling numbers that may or may not be accurate certainly reflect a view against our troops staying there for too long, and certainly against an increase. General Craddock, in a recent letter to President Obama, the heads of state of Great Britain, Germany, and France said it was time to discuss metrics and timelines for international activities in Afghanistan. And while I understand that you favor staying the course in Afghanistan, do we at least agree that by making clear that we do not intend to occupy the country indefinitely, we may be better able to build support among the American and European people for our efforts in that country?
Thank you, Senator. Yes, I would definitely agree to that. I don't think the intent there is to ever occupy and stay. The key, as has been pointed out, is the enabling and development of the Afghan National Security Forces. As the SACEUR for the last 2.5 years, I repeatedly told NATO nations the very first thing we need are more trainers for the Army and the police, particularly the police. The issue is more a public security issue than a national security issue for the people of Afghanistan. And a police, competent, trained, non-corrupt police force is important. So I think that what we have to do is to lay out then a timeline for development of the Afghan security forces and hold both international support to that and the Afghans to that, so that we can, one, establish some parameters, some milestones, and meet them, and then measure effectiveness.
Thank you, General. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator. Senator Corker.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and thank each of you. I think this is an outstanding panel, and as we had yesterday, and each of you have unique contributions. Ambassador Crocker, I want to thank you especially for your tremendous service. And I think the testimony that you and General Petraeus gave as we looked at a new strategy in Iraq was most important. And I think you alluded in your opening testimony how having people from the field here may be the most important thing we can do to actually ascertain what is the next best step. So, Mr. Chairman, I hope that's going to happen soon. I hope it's going to happen in the next few weeks. I notice there's a resistance for some reason for that to happen, but I could not agree more. I would also say that the themes that before we even move to our strategic interest in Afghanistan, it seems to me there are two themes that sort of underneath that. One is that we're there, meaning that something for us, I think, to remember into the future. Once we put our flag up in a country, our flag is up, and we're very resistant to ever leaving, so that's an underlying theme. And number two, that we're sort of trying to prove to Pakistan and Afghanistan that we're not fair weather friends. So there's sort of two underlying themes that make that I know weigh much of what's happening before you even get into the strategic interest piece, and that's pretty prevalent in both countries when you're there. So let me just ask you this, Ambassador Crocker, what expectations should we have in Afghanistan? What worries me to some degree is we had a success in Iraq based on a surge. We had a political movement that you helped create with the Sunni awakening and getting them working on our side. There have been discussions about doing the same with the Taliban. We're obviously talking about additional troops. What are the things that we should expect in Afghanistan, and what are the lessons that are not necessarily transferable and those that are?
Thank you, sir. I'm probably the least qualified person in the room to talk about Afghanistan in that degree of depth. I would say, though, that I think there is, as the chairman alluded to earlier, there is a linkage between terror and insurgency. My experience has been that terror can find a nest within a broader insurgency. In other words, I cannot see how, if we define our interests narrowly as eliminating a terrorist threat out of Afghanistan, that we can do that with any real degree of assurance without also having a successful counterinsurgency strategy. And that, again, in my not very well-informed view, takes us into the range of issues that Ms. Lockhart and Dr. Husseini touched on. I don't think there is much of a record anywhere in the world of successful counterinsurgencies without good enough governance. Now, how far does this go? There I am absolutely unable to state, but clearly there is, I think, an obligation for the administration to so state. That review is obviously underway. I think the sooner it can be brought to the point of articulation, again, what are our goals, why they are important, how they will be achieved, and how the different components link up, I think is essential for the American people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the, in fairness, administration has been rhetorical about this narrow mission to make it sound good, but in essence, all the things Ms. Lockhart has laid out are components of a counterinsurgency. And so, Mrs. Lockhart, I think you did a very, basically, you're talking about, in some degree, state building or nation building. I think we all know that those are the metrics that have been laid out. And so we have this very poor country that's been very poor for a long time. There are no oil resources like there were in Iraq. And so we're talking about building an education system and a health system, a water system, an electricity system, a security system, a police system. What are your thoughts about how we should view our long-term financial commitments? Because let's face it, on the budget they have now, they couldn't pay for even a fraction of just the police that they have there. I'm just wondering if you might help us there. And I'm not sure we see any future for resources to do that in Afghanistan for the midterm.
Certainly, and I think as we've discussed, the civilian governance effort has been significantly under-resourced, and an increase in resources is certainly going to be necessary. I think we probably need to look at two different scenarios for resourcing. One scenario is if there is a process for rebuilding a legitimate government and a team of Afghan leaders in place who can govern responsibly. And I think in that scenario, we're looking at far fewer external resources that will be needed, because Afghanistan will move more rapidly to collecting its own revenue. And while Afghanistan doesn't have oil, it does have the potential, I believe, to be raising somewhere between $5 to $10 billion a year in its own revenue, because it does have very rich mineral resources, including copper, gold, lapis, amethyst, iron. It does have the basis for a successful agricultural economy. It was the largest exporter of fruit and nuts to the region, if not the world, in the 70s. And it has a hard-working population, and the potential for textile production, urban services, and a construction industry are certainly there. So I think we need to move to put in place an economic strategy that will gear it to revenue. To answer your specific question on what resources are needed, I believe that we need to be looking at a medium to long-term commitment of resources of probably roughly a doubling of existing resources on the civilian and governance side. But that if we move aggressively to raise Afghan revenue, or to enable the Afghans to collect their own revenue, that commitment could taper down in the second 5 years of the decade.
If I could ask one more brief question. Thank you very much. General Craddock, how many al-Qaeda are there in the world?
Senator, I have no idea. Card-carrying al-Qaeda, I have no idea. Sympathizers, logistic support, finance support, I have no idea.
Card-carrying. Give me.
I don't know. I think that one of the reasons it's so difficult in our search is because there's no hierarchy that we would recognize.
You know, the number 2,000 has been thrown out, and people dispute that, and I don't know what the number is. The reason I ask the question, it's somewhat rhetorical. Our efforts towards al-Qaeda have now created a situation where we're involved in two major nation-building, state-building efforts, Iraq and Afghanistan, and it's just a fact. And I hope that somehow or another we'll figure out a different strategy versus going around the world building states and nations almost out of whole cloth.
Thank you very much, Senator Corker. Senator Casey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank our witnesses for your presence here today and the contribution you're making to this discussion and debate. I think we can have a real debate about these policies, and I think it's critical that we do. I want to especially thank General Craddock and Ambassador Crocker for your service to our country under the most difficult of circumstances. And I wanted to start with you, Ambassador Crocker, about a conversation that you and I had, and I don't expect you to remember any of this, but a lot of members of Congress visited you while you were in Iraq. But this was August of '07. Senator Durbin and I were with you at that time, and we had a dinner meeting, and General Petraeus was with us as well. And I was very critical at the time, and I still am, about the language of Washington when we describe the conflict in Iraq, but also now the conflict in Afghanistan. Language like victory and defeat, win or lose, which in my judgment is both inaccurate and misleading. And I think it's important as we get the policy right on troop levels and on non-military commitments as well, that we also get the language right, because the American people will not and should not have patience for a political debate in Washington that doesn't address ask and answer some tough questions. At the time, you said something I'll never forget, and I think I want to ask you if the language that you used then is still relevant here and what you learned from not just your service in Iraq, but other service as well. You said at the time that the words you used to describe success in Iraq were two, as I recall: sustainable stability. And I'd ask you, in the context of Afghanistan and how we deal with this strategy with regard to Afghanistan and Pakistan, are those words still operative? And anything else you can tell us about how you think we can achieve that?
Thank you, Senator. I do indeed remember the conversation, and I would share your view about the use of language. Language does count. I think if anyone ever cared to go through the interminable records of the testimony that General Petraeus and I provided to the Congress on several occasions, I don't think you'll find a single occasion in which either of us used those terms to win, to lose, victory and defeat, because in many respects those are not for us to determine. As
I said Washington to leave out some names.
Thank you, Senator. Yes, I believe the concept of sustainable stability is valid, although I may now shamelessly steal Ms. Lockhart's phrase of good enough governance, which I think is another way of saying much the same thing, of steps taken, measures taken that will work in terms of the society in which it counts, be it Iraq, Afghanistan, or Pakistan. It may not be our model, and it may be very far from perfect. But if it provides a situation in which the security forces of that country are capable dealing themselves with whatever challenges to stability there are, then I think you've got sustainable stability. What that will look like in Afghanistan, and again, what the steps are to achieve it, I'm simply not competent to provide. I do think we've got the people out there who can do that, and I think, again, that what the administration needs to do is to lay out that framework. And then, since I had the experience of testifying before Congress, I would like to spread the opportunity to my current colleagues in the field to come and do the same, because I do think that field view is extremely important.
Thank you. And I have questions I won't get to both for both ends of the table, but I do want to, I probably have time for one more. I wanted to ask Dr. Lockhart a question about what's sometimes referred to as a civilian surge, an increase in the number of non-military personnel on the ground, which is a low number now in Afghanistan and is building. I was very impressed, as we always are, in August when I visited both countries and saw not just the respect that General McChrystal had for the non-military folks, but how well integrated they were and how central they are to the mission. State Department folks, Department of Agriculture, USAID, DEA, I mean, I've probably left some entity out, many others, but I guess I have and this is a hard question to answer, but if you can do your best in the minute or so we have left. One, how many do you think or do you have a sense of those metrics? And you may have addressed this in your opening that I missed because I wasn't in the room when you gave your opening. Or the end, I was here for the very end of your opening. And also, how do we get it right with regard to our international partners who candidly, in some places they're helping us a lot, and in a lot of significant parts of the world they're not doing much at all to help us. So if you can address that in terms of numbers or in terms of commitment. I know that's a hard one, but...
Certainly, and I think one of the first principles to work from is that what we're seeking to build is the space and tools for Afghan leadership and Afghan ownership. And I believe that while the key focus on the civilian side is institution building, it actually requires quite a small number of civilians. Certainly we need more civilians than there are at the moment. I probably wouldn't want to put a number on it. It probably isn't more than 1,000. But the key...
In terms of 1,000, what we would need eventually, or kind of where we are now?
A total number, particularly if there's going to be US leadership. There are actually tens of thousands of foreign civilians in the country at the moment, but most of them are fragmented amongst NGOs, UN agencies, and all sorts of efforts. But I think a total of 1,000. What is required, though, is a really thorough look at the skills gap on the Afghan side, and I think we should re-gear our focus to what does it take to build up Afghan capability, and that does mean vocational training, secondary education, and tertiary education. Back in 2001, no investment was made in secondary, tertiary education or vocational training, and if you're educating Afghan Stage 11, you're not going to get a competent civil service. So that's the lacuna I think we should be looking at. In terms of getting the international partnership right, I think that relates to your earlier comment very much, that we should move away from the language of war, of victory, and of loss, to back perhaps to some of the original language used in the 2001-2 period of a global effort to assist the Afghan people establish stability or legitimate governance. And then, based on that, look at a division of labour and burden sharing. I think we need perhaps to look more to the economic multilateral organisations like the World Bank and the ADB that have robust approaches to accountability, while a UN mandate remains important, and then look at a division of labour with Europe and what countries like China, Saudi Arabia and Gulf countries and Japan can do to contribute as part of a global alliance.
Doctor, I had a refugee question, General, I had a question, but I'm out of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Casey. Senator Wicker.
Thank you, Senator Lugar. I want to get back to one of the many excellent points that Senator Lugar mentioned during his extensive question, and ask about the election. Now, today's the 17th. We're supposed to hear some definitive results. I'm told the Afghan Central Election Commission has released the results showing that President Karzai has received 54.62% of the vote. Now, the international community is still waiting for the Independent Election Commission to make its assessment. Senator Lugar raised the possibility that as many as 1/3 of President Karzai's votes might be invalid. I wonder if any of you can tell me when we can expect to hear something from the Independent Election Commission. It seems to me that in listening to the administration, that there's almost a resignation that President Karzai is going to be the president for the next term, and that somehow those results will be allowed to stand to the extent that either he will be reelected on the first go-around or he will win a runoff. So I hope several of you can comment on this, but let me start with Dr. Hosseini. You're here on behalf of the UNHCR, I realize, but still, you've been in the area, you've talked extensively. I assume you've talked across the spectrum of the ethnic groups in Afghanistan. So what is your assessment of the support among the populace for President Karzai, of their feeling with regard to the validity of the election results, and what might happen?
Well, I think when you speak to ordinary Afghans, there's no question that they express some disappointment in the performance of the Afghan government so far. I think many of them expected more, again, rightfully so. As far as the elections, clearly there have been some irregularities with these elections, and they've been well publicized. And precise scale of these irregularities and whether they will force a second round of the elections is up to the ECC and the IEC to determine. And they're examining the suspected ballots and doing a recount. In my view, It's important, obviously, that this investigation be thorough, but also that it be relatively expeditious. And I say this as an individual and not as with my UNHCR hat on. You know, I think it's to the detriment of the country to have a prolonged period of political paralysis. It's to the detriment of the legitimacy of the elections, and I think it would exacerbate the Afghan people's already high level of anxiety about the elections and cast doubt on the credibility of the outcome. So I think it must be done relatively quickly, and of course the outcome has to be acceptable to most Afghans and have at least the semblance of credibility, a difficult task indeed. On the elections, I do want to put the entire process in some kind of perspective and say that as flawed as the elections are, and we shouldn't compare the second ever presidential elections in Afghanistan to the process here in the States or in France. Let's be clear about that. But it was an extraordinary logistic achievement to even hold these elections, even more so than the last time around. 3,000 donkeys carrying ballots, thousands of people who had to be trained in the middle of conflict, in insurgent-racked areas, under the threat and intimidation of the Taliban. Hundreds of female searchers that had to pat down anybody in a burqa to make sure it's not a man carrying a suicide jacket. Those are the sorts of logistics we're talking about. So from a logistical standpoint, it was an extraordinary achievement. And the second point of perspective that I would offer is that for 30 years now, the traditional means of the transfer of power in Afghanistan has been through violence, through the gun. With these elections, the Afghans have an opportunity to demonstrate that those days are in the past and that they can effect a peaceful transition of power. And maybe we in the international community ought not to rush to judgment, and we ought to wait and let the Afghans resolve this peacefully.
Ms. Lockhart, would you like to comment about that? And do you believe President Karzai has majority support among the population of Afghanistan?
If the European Union's announcement today that they suspect that a third of the votes were invalid, then it will be demonstrated that the incumbent doesn't have majority support. And I would agree with Dr. Hussaini that I think there's considerable anxiety amongst the population and a loss of trust in their government over the last few years. What we're seeing at the moment on the ground is the Electoral Complaints Commission investigating the irregularities, a process that may take several weeks. And I very much agree that that process should be resolved as quickly as possible because the vacuum in leadership will be problematic on the ground. I think there are four options very quickly from here on. One is to accept the victory of the incumbent. The risk of this approach is that the alliances with illegitimate forces that have been made, I don't think will assure good enough governance over the coming months and years and may see a further deterioration in governance. A second approach is to accept that and then have a robust counterinsurgency effort to build good governance bottom up. That hasn't been tried in other insurgencies in the past, and the jury will be open as to whether it could be successful. A third option, I think, would be to accept the victory of the incumbent, but have a robust agreement on benchmarks for accountability going forward. And I believe that the Afghan people will be looking for the international community to take a robust approach on asking for standards of accountability and benchmarks of reaching good governance. And the last option would be to go back to the drawing board. If the ECC is to invalidate a sufficient number of ballots, or one or more of the candidates, or the process as a whole, that will open the question of moving to a new peace agreement or a new bond type agreement.
Well, I'm sure you agree that it should be done expeditiously. You have any idea when we might hear something definitive from the ECC?
I believe that's specified in the ECC regulations that they must report back within a specified amount of time after the 17th of September when results are declared. I believe that's a month, but I could check that.
Thank you. Anyone else on the panel wish to touch on this? Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Wicker. Senator Webb.
Thank you, Senator Lugar, and I would like to express my appreciation to the chairman and to you for having put together this extraordinary variety of expertise in the panel today. I don't know any American public servant who has had more time on the ground, intellectual dedication, and emotional commitment than Ambassador Crocker, and it's great to see you here today, sir. And Dr. Hosseini, as someone who spent a good part of his life as a novelist and also having worked in the dread Hollywood off and on for about 15 years, I have an incredible admiration for the literary achievement that you were able to bring in Kite Runner. I think I've often said that you can communicate to people on an emotional level through a piece of literature in a way that they come to understand things probably better than any other way, and it's just an amazingly powerful film, and I congratulate you on what it took to put it together. All about, so rare to see a piece of literature that can hit all the issues of loyalty and respect and father-son relationships and all those sorts of things. It was just an amazing achievement. I would like to begin by expressing my appreciation actually for what Senator Corker said, because it does address the difficulty that we have up here in this particular issue, and that is when you look at where we seem to be going here from a national strategic perspective and from a perspective of national interest, American national interest in terms of how we use our assets, where we put out our expenditures in terms of national treasure, whether we should build up an infrastructure to address an enemy that is basically a mobile enemy. And we saw this in Iraq, quite frankly. We built up a huge infrastructure to address two different sets of problems. One was the issue of international terrorism, which is intrinsically mobile and decided to relocate after a period of time, but then also to have to pick up the pieces of what we had done following our invasion and trying to repair relationships and move Iraq forward. In terms of the advantage that the forces of international terrorism wish to have, that was pretty good for them long term. We spent hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars, and they remain active. We're looking at something similar here in Afghanistan, and I know we've got national mission creep going on now, talking about whether we really are going to attempt to basically build a state here. And there's going to be a debate about this. And, I look at what happened in Somalia a couple days ago. And if you're really talking about going after the forces of international terrorism, that was a pretty effective way to do it. Coming over the horizon, hitting an element of international terrorism, not leaving behind an infrastructure, and being able to have the same maneuverability as your enemy has. On the other hand, we are moving forward with a different debate here, and we will have that debate. The question is not whether there is no military solution, which has sort of been agreed upon. It is whether the military component of this solution is one that is going to work. And I say all that because I would like to ask you on your panel here to look at this from two different perspectives. First, at what point do we reach a tipping point with the United States military where the presence and the operations might actually be counterproductive? This has been raised before. But there's an additional component to this that I have a good deal of concern on, and that is to what extent in Afghanistan can we actually build a national army? I've asked this question to General Petraeus and General McChrystal. I asked it to Admiral Mullen the other day. This is not a country that has had experience with national army. It's a country with a lot of national pride. But the best that I can see is that at one period in the mid to late 1900s, there was a national army of about 90,000. If you take the police with us, we're talking about 250,000. So on the one hand, at what point does our presence reach a tipping point where it's counterproductive, where people believe that we are an occupying force or whatever you want to put on it, and then can we actually do the other piece of this in terms of the history of the country? And Dr. Lockhart, I'd actually like to get your views on that as a starting point.
I do believe that there is potentially a point at which presence may be counterproductive, but I don't believe we've reached that yet. And I think the only way that can be tested or ascertained is through polling and observation of the population. I believe, like Dr. Hussaini, that on balance, yes, while there are shades of now criticism that the presence is an occupation, those are very much in the minority. And the majority of the population seeks very much and hopes very much that the US commitment remains and the international partnership remains for the long-term stability of the country. In terms of the possibility of building national institutions, whether the army or other institutions, I believe it absolutely is possible, and the remarkable success of the efforts since 2001 to build up the Afghan National Army. I had the honor to observe the 1st Battalion graduate and walk down the street, and it was welcomed literally with cheers of the population. And the pride of the people in that institution was remarkable, because they deeply understand that it's through institutions like that that their daily needs and basically their security can be met. And we've seen that in the Afghan National Army, and then across the different institutions where Afghans with a minimal commitment to training and education do rise to the challenge of managing their own institutions.
Thank you. Ambassador Crocker, I remember you and I had an exchange several years ago with the situation in Iraq, and one of your strongly made points was that the Iraqis of all different ethnicities had come together in a national army. In fact, your point had been that I think more than 200,000 Shia had actually died fighting in the Iran-Iraq war. What are your thoughts about the situation with respect to Afghanistan?
Well, the fortunate thing for me, Senator, is I represent no one but myself these days. So as uninformed as my opinions may be, at least I'm entitled to have them, and since you asked to express them. I do believe that what we have seen thus far shows us, with all of the shortcomings in terms of manpower, material, and even abilities, that the Afghans are capable of developing and fielding national forces. As I understand it, perhaps the Army more so than the police, but even with the police. And as you noted, sir, while Afghanistan has a history of challenges to central governments, it also has a history of a national military. And my sense is that Afghans are quite proud of the tradition of that military in the country's history. So I think it can be done. I think it is being done. But as we saw in Iraq, this takes time. The early tests that, as you know, that the Iraqi security forces faced almost took them apart. So I think that we and the Afghans have to be careful not to put more of a burden on these developing forces than they can bear at this time. Like so many things in this part of the world, whether it's Iraq, Pakistan, or Afghanistan, this will take time. And nowhere, I think, is that more the case than it is in the development of these security forces.
My time has expired, but I appreciate both of your answers. And of course, the difficulty is the other side of that, that the more time we have with the size of the American presence, the more risk we have of being viewed in a different light. But I thank you for your comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Webb. Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Lockhart, thank you for all the work that you've done in Afghanistan, and especially in the post-September 11th period when you were there and on the ground helping to lay out the foundation on which we can move forward in Afghanistan. You laid out 4 distinct options for governance in this post-election, but you didn't say whether you thought there was a preferred means of action. Do you think one of those options is preferable?
I think thank you for your kind words. I think the first 2 options I outlined of letting the current governance arrangements continue unchecked, or that plus trying to build governance bottom up while we have a vacuum, in essence, at the top, are not going to be desirable and probably would not lead to success. I think the 2 other options, one of accepting the victory of the incumbent, but putting in place very strict conditions, a roadmap, and agreeing on benchmarks, particularly on financial accountability, and asking for some devolution of power and putting in place checks and balances would be one preferred option, and the other would be to go back to the drawing board and putting in place a new transitional authority, which would probably govern for a 2 to 4 year period, and one of whose central tasks will be organising a more robust set of elections next time, which will require, I think, this inquiry into what went wrong and what are the institutions that are necessary to have a successful election, one of which will be a census.
And does that run the risk of creating a perception that the international community is making the determination about the future of Afghanistan and sort of erasing the elections, even recognizing that the elections might be flawed?
I think that option would only be possible if the ECC, which is a domestic Afghan institution, would first rule that either one or more of the candidates, the process, or a certain number of ballots were invalid. So it would have to rest on that domestic determination. And then a lot of care would have to be taken to ensure that the process moved forward in accordance with the Afghan constitution, and there are provisions within the constitution that would allow that to take place.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Dr. Husseini, this question is really both for you and for Dr. Lockhart, I think, and I, like Senator Webb, very much appreciate your books and think that they're wonderful and have probably done as much as any policy in this country to make Americans care about what happens in Afghanistan. So thank you for that. What do you see happening on the ground in terms of coordination of aid among the international entities that are in Afghanistan and the UN? And several of you have referenced that. And what should be done better to improve that coordination and to deal with the corruption and the fraud that seems to be happening too much there?
Thank you for your kind words, and I may have to defer a good chunk of this question to my more qualified colleagues on the panel, but there's a perception in Afghanistan among civilians that of the billions of dollars that have come to Afghanistan, not a whole lot of it has reached the Afghans themselves. There's a sense of disappointment that even though Afghanistan has been at the focus of international attention now for several years, by and large, for average Afghans, the quality of life has not improved significantly. Most Afghans are still lacking for basic social services, the same as they were a number of years ago. I will just say that of much of the money that comes to Afghanistan, only a fraction of it ends up in the pocket of the Afghans themselves. So much of the money is spent on providing security for the foreign presence within the aid organization and the bureaucrats, to paying the salary of consultants. Much of the resources and the services that are utilized in Afghanistan are outsourced and therefore don't provide opportunity and employment for the Afghans themselves. And of course, much of the money bypasses the Afghan government itself, kind of reinforcing the image of the government as sort of being an impotent bystander. And I think those are all issues that have to be addressed. But I'm going to defer to my other colleagues about more on the issue.
Thank you. I don't know, Dr. Lockhart, Ambassador Crocker, General Craddock, who would like to take a shot at that.
Just a few observations. I think it's a terribly important point because I think that's been the failure to coordinate aid has actually fed into the corruption within the Afghan institutions. I think first is developing a robust, not being afraid of putting a robust set of conditions for aid, either through a World Bank IMF program or a US or multilateral agreement. And central to that would be insisting on transparency, particularly in licensing and revenue, as well as expenditure and audits that should be released to the Afghan public. Second is putting the Afghan budget and institutions central. The Afghan budget is the policy coordination mechanism on the ground. I think we're making a mistake when we ask the UN to coordinate. UN mandate is important. The UN cannot coordinate. It's the Afghan budget. And we need a roadmap for each ministry. We've got a roadmap for the Afghan National Army. We need the same type of roadmap for the other institutions. And then I think we have got a coordination mechanism. It's the ARTF, the Afghan Reconstruction Trust Fund, which is managed by the World Bank, and it acts as a dual key system on the flow of money, and using that or developing a parallel type of trust fund for US resources would be essential. And then where NGOs, UN agencies or private companies are contracted, then I think we need to apply the same set of robust requests for transparency and accountability, which to date haven't been in place.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Crocker, do you have anything that you want to add to that?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Thank you both, Ambassador Crocker and General Craddock, for your service as well.
Senator Kaufman.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you and the ranking member for holding these hearings right now, timely. I mean, I think this decision that's going to be made right now is one of the most important decisions we're going to be dealing with in a Senate where we're dealing with a lot of important decisions. And bringing the light to this thing is just, and having the panels we did, panels today and the panel yesterday have been excellent, just the right people. So I just want to, I cannot commend you enough for doing this. And I want to thank everybody on the panel. I mean, just having the ability of listening to what you have to say is so helpful in trying to deal with this. I just have a few questions. One is, it's been mentioned by a number of senators and also in the popular press that the Somalia raid is kind of a model for U.S. operations in Afghanistan. Is the Somalia raid a model for U.S. operations in Afghanistan?
Thank you, Senator. Complex question. I'm not sure it's a model. I think it's a tool, and I think it has already been going on in Afghanistan over the past several years through the U.S. counterterrorism forces, not so much the NATO counterinsurgent capability, with significant results. But again, with a hierarchy that's amorphous, cells operating as opposed to a vertical hierarchy, it's very difficult to be able to make long-term gains because someone always then steps up. However, it is an ongoing day-to-day operation done very precisely. It's what you don't hear that's probably more important than what you hear.
Great. Anyone else?
Senator, I think that's a very important question that certainly is beyond my expertise to adequately answer. But it is, I think, worth posing to those in the administration more qualified. My sense is that the Somalia model, if you will, probably cannot be successfully replicated in Afghanistan. I think the dynamics there are more complex. I also think, frankly, that given that the ISAF commander in Afghanistan, General McChrystal, is perhaps the most capable special operations commander that this country has ever produced, that if he thought it could be done that way, I think we'd be seeing different sets of recommendations.
Great, thank you. There's a discussion about expediting the elections Senator Wicker raised, and I think obviously that would be key to everyone. Does anyone on the panel, I met with Abdullah 2 weeks ago, I don't think there's always a chance that he might throw in with Karzai, but I think it's remote. But just for the sake of this question, can anybody think of any way to expedite the end of this election without considering that there's some kind of coalition government?
Senator, and that's a very important question. I'm not sure there is a way to expedite it. I think there will be a tendency to allow the ECC to complete its investigations and then make a determination on whether the process has met the standards of a fair enough election. I think the only thing that could bring it to a resolution earlier would be the coming together within the Afghan political elite of enough of the candidates, critically Abdullah and Karzai, but potentially others within the political elite, and who would agree to form a type of unity government.
I mean, I think it's key that, I mean, this is the worst possible time for this to happen. So if anybody comes up with any ideas, I hear a lot of talk about expediting it, but I've not heard a single person give us a way to kind of get to where we have to get to. So if you come up with anything, I would very much appreciate it. Let's talk about the civilian surge for a second, because Senator Lugar's raised that a number of times, and it's really, really important. One of the problems is recruiting people. How do we improve recruitment of civil and foreign service officers to move away from, as we move away from reliance on contractors?
Senator, if I could just take one element of that that I'm drawing from my experience in Iraq. We need more efficient mechanisms in government to be able to respond to complex contingencies like Iraq and Afghanistan. Simply put, there are not enough people, period, not enough people with the skill sets that are required in these contingencies within the Foreign Service, either state or USAID. It requires a process to bring in able talent from other agencies and from the private sector. And that still, frankly, does not work very well. It's what's called the 3161 process, and I can tell you that is painful in the extreme to make that work quickly, getting the right people in the right places. I know that the administration has put more emphasis on building up what's called SCRS within the State Department as a means of providing a civilian reserve, if you will. I would applaud that, but a great deal more needs to be done to put in place the structures that will allow an administration to identify and quickly bring to the field the numbers and the skill sets that simply do not exist within the established foreign affairs agencies.
I think it's good you point out the difficulty of this. People kind of glaze over. The Senator Lugar's been talking about this for quite a while, and this is really key. If we're going to be fighting wars of counterinsurgency in the future, we just kind of glaze over this. It isn't there. You know, we're trying to get people now. We're having a hard enough time in Afghanistan, but planning down the road is really, really important. Can I just ask you another question, kind of your experience in Iraq? And it's two things. One is, how is, we're trying to get the Taliban to come over, kind of like we did with the Sons of Iraq in Anbar province. Would you comment on whether you think that's possible in Afghanistan?
I do think it's possible. Again, I'm not in a position to comment with any detail on the dynamics there. But once again, I think we've got the right people in this fight. Both General McChrystal, of course, with his substantial experience in Afghanistan and in Iraq, where I had the privilege of serving with him, and then General Petraeus, in many respects the architect of the awakening strategy, of course, now has oversight of both campaigns. So I have a high level of confidence that we do have the people engaged on this that can figure out what can be done and how to do it. All of that said, and again, my colleagues, Dr. Lockhart and Dr. Hussaini, are far more qualified to speak to it. It's going to be a very different and more difficult process. The Sunni insurgency in Iraq was not deeply rooted in time or in ideology. The Taliban, of course, are both.
I thank you very much, and I want to tell you, I think everyone agrees that our success in Iraq was based on the people we had there, and obviously one of the very, very best people was you, and the people we have in Afghanistan, General McChrystal, Eikenberry, Rodriguez, McChrystal. We've got a good team, Holbrook covering the whole region. We've got a good team over there, too. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Kaufman. Let me follow up on a few things if I can. Sort of a parallel to a couple of questions that Senator Kaufman was asking, but on the issue of the Taliban, which is central to this. Actually, before I get to that, I want to ask you, General Craddock, because it's important to our understanding of what the options are in the Taliban. As a Supreme Allied Commander, you were commanding NATO forces, and you're very familiar with the tensions within that bloc at this point. My sense is that we are losing our allies' enthusiasm for this effort, and that a number of them, I won't go into the details here, but have been very reluctant all along to engage. Their troops don't engage, and looking to them for additional support here, I mean, I think essentially we're going to kind of be on our own here, and I think we got to kind of, is that a fair assessment?
Senator, I think that's a fair assessment from a military perspective. I would agree. There is unequal burden sharing among the alliance with regards to those who will and those who won't. I do think, however, there's opportunity with NATO allies to ask for trainers in areas where it may not be as risky and they may have some political viability. I think they should be asked for civilian surge capability. There's plenty of that in Europe. And if you knock down the wall between NATO and the EU, you might be able to access a lot of that capability that we need there.
Well, I'd like to examine, that's a good thought there, but I want to examine this attitude a little bit. Do they know something that we don't know?
Well, I can't speak for them in terms of what they know.
Well, but you've had these conversations. I've had these conversations, and you have too. There is an attitudinal difference about the threat. There's a threat definition difference, isn't there?
Indeed.
But isn't that important for us to understand?
Well, I think it's been discussed here. In Europe, terrorism is viewed as a police issue when it's visited upon their people. And you deal with it then as opposed to stopping it before it gets into your country. So the military generally does not deal with terrorism to the extent that we do here because of the attacks.
But I think their perception goes actually deeper than that. I think there's a sense, there's a different sense of sort of how you manage this over a period of time. You're nodding your head, Ms. Lockhart. You want to share your perception of that? Your body language got you in trouble here.
I think twofold. I would agree that there is absolutely a waning enthusiasm amongst public opinion in Europe. I think that's partly because there has yet to be a credible articulation of exactly what the strategy is going to be, and particularly the failures in Helmand in Britain is infecting the public debate. And that's, again, partly because in Helmand there was not a credible articulation of a governance and development strategy. So that remains open. And I do believe the public opinion could be reconvinced if that strategy is to be articulated, because
Your strategy involves a pretty significant commitment of resources, investment, personnel, civilians. I mean, it really is a nation-building strategy.
It is, and I believe that there will be more appetite in Europe and other countries for engagement on training, as General Craddock articulated, and on the civilian surge elements, and particularly in areas like capacity building and economic investment. So a sensible division of labour going forwards may be to look to support from allies, particularly in Europe and Japan, for that civilian type of assistance, recognising that the US will continue to bear the brunt.
And General Craddock, we're going to get some folks who are more, hopefully, operational with respect to Afghanistan itself as we go down the road here. But from a military perspective, in order to do the kinds of things that Ms. Lockhart and others have talked about doing in building the governance, building the capacity building and so forth, you got to have some security. But is it possible to do the security without the kind of current engagement and civilian collateral deaths that we currently have? Or is that, are the insurgents always capable of guaranteeing that you have that even if you don't want it? And is that a great danger here?
It's my judgment that in irregular warfare, and given what we know about the insurgents, that they were always capable of arranging that situation. I can give you chapter and verse over and over again of operations and targeting that looked fine but didn't turn out that way for a myriad of reasons. But again, the use of civilians as shields is very difficult to combat. Now, having said that, I think we can continue to work to minimize. I think that the tactical guidance put into place by General McChrystal recently has gone a long way and will continue to do that to minimize that pushback. If I may, a point that Ms. Lockhart raised. The British strategy in Helmand, the Dutch strategy in Aruzgan, the strategy here or there, the U.S. strategy in Paktika or Nangarhar. One of the problems we face is the arrangement of NATO. Nations view their own provinces as a fiefdom, or provinces, as the case the U.S. has a regional command, so they deal with that at the expense of dealing with the country as a whole. And it has caused us problems over time.
I agree with that. I think one of the most significant problems has been the absence for almost 8 years of a unified command and a unified strategy. In fact, and people need to understand this is important as we think about Afghanistan, we have traveled this journey for almost 7 years without a strategy. There was sort of a, just a continuum at the expense of Iraq. And I think most people have agreed that troops were diverted, resources were deserted, focus was diverted. So it has only been in these last months that people have begun to really hone in and say, how do you adjust? The challenge, as I wrote back last February, is the clock ticking. The amount of time that's been lost to the corruption, to the, to the other things, and can you make it up? And I want to come back to that for a moment, Ambassador Crocker, if I can. With respect to the Taliban, you made a very perceptive observation in answer to Senator Kaufman's question, and you noted the historical, cultural depth of the Taliban versus the insurgency in Iraq. There are different, however, we keep hearing about sort of different shades of Taliban. And can you share with us perhaps, to what degree can the Taliban be sort of divided in a way here? Is there a diplomatic / civilian ability to reach out to them and in fact give them something that they want more than being Taliban, and therefore isolating the really hardcore Taliban, or are we dealing with a monolithic entity?
Mr. Chairman, I would make a few observations on the methodology, if you will, and then perhaps Dr. Husseini, Dr. Lockhart would have some comments more on the nature of the Taliban as they see it, because that's not my area of expertise. The principle we followed in Iraq was exactly what you suggest. It was talking to anyone who would talk to us, without regard to what they may have done to us in the past. Trying to find splits, fissures, differences of view, people who would be susceptible to whatever blandishment we might offer, to break up an insurgency, if you will, to pull people either to our side or at least into the neutral zone. And we did that without spending a tremendous amount of time trying to figure out what ideological persuasion might exist here or there. We just kind of went at it. We got the word out that we're open for discussion. It seems to me that a similar approach has great potential also in Afghanistan, because the Taliban is not a monolithic organization. They are not card-carrying members. There have to be many different motivations and levels of commitment So it's by seeking ways to engage, to discuss, direct, indirect, that I think we'll find what the limits are of shrinking an adversary down to the smallest possible number of irreconcilables. As we put it in terms of Iraq, you want to reduce the number of people who absolutely have to be killed to the smallest number possible. And I think, again, the same methodology will work in Afghanistan, but my colleagues would be far more knowledgeable on the nature of what we're dealing with there.
Do you want to comment, either of you? Before just quickly, I want to try to...
Sure. I agree with the Ambassador. Taliban are not monolithic movement if they ever were. The term Taliban now refers to a cluster of different groups that more or less answer to different leadership. So part of the challenge of, and again, I'm sort of out of my element here, but just part of the challenge of negotiating with these people is that there's no, in the absence of clear leadership structure, it's difficult to determine who exactly you speak to. And in addition, at the present time, it seems to me the Taliban have no incentive really to negotiate, because the perception is that they've managed to frustrate the coalition. In addition, the United States would likely ask the Taliban to sever their ties to the more radical groups like al-Qaeda, and they may be reluctant to do that. And the Taliban in exchange may say to the Afghan government they will negotiate, but we need the foreigners to leave the country. And again, these are very difficult and challenging preconditions. That said, I think that there's an opportunity to at least engage some of the more so-called moderate members of the Taliban. These would be the more Afghan, the more reconcilable elements. If there's a tradition in Afghanistan is switching allegiances. We saw that over and over again during the Civil War in Afghanistan. And if anything, Afghans are a pragmatic people. And if certain elements of at least the Afghan movement can be convinced that it's in their self-interest and in their pragmatic interest to come over to the other side, they may be interested in doing that. But I will say that on my recent trip to Afghanistan, I spoke to a lot of people on the street, and my sense is that by and large, a lot of people, although they don't feel any necessarily any kinship with the Taliban, they are in favor of some kind of negotiation between the West and the Taliban.
Thank you. Senator Lugar, do you have any more questions? Senator Casey?
Mr. Chairman, at the risk of, I know we have to move on, but I felt guilty that I had not asked the Doctor and the General a question, so at the risk of delaying things, just two quick questions. One is, Doctor, with regard, first of all, I want to commend the work of UNHCR across the world. We had hearings at the subcommittee level on refugees in both Iraq and Pakistan. And I was very interested in what you said about the refugee challenge in Afghanistan. I guess I'd ask you this question. What's the short-term or the near-term challenge with regard to this question of, I guess we refer to as reintegration, first, and then second, what is the likelihood that there's going to be a dramatic increase in the number of refugees in Afghanistan, which becomes, in all refugee situations, and I saw this firsthand, not the problems with it, but just a good example of what's happening on the ground in Pakistan. We visited an IDP camp there where internally displaced people were seemed to be, for the most part, treated well and seem to be moving back to their communities. But if it doesn't go well, you have both a humanitarian and a security problem. But I guess I'd ask you, first of all, on your sense of the increase that may occur in Afghanistan in terms of the number of refugees, and secondly, the challenge of reintegration.
Like, just before you answer, I need to go down to the Finance Committee for a few minutes on the health care thing, but I just want to thank the panel for your contributions today. It's been very, very helpful. We have a distance to go yet, but I think we're beginning to shed some light on it, and we're very grateful to you for taking time to be here today. And I thank my colleagues, and whoever wants to be the last questioner, just close it out. Thanks.
Thank you, Chairman Kerry.
Reintegration of Afghan refugees continues to be a very difficult challenge. And to put it in perspective, let's remember that Afghanistan, even in its heyday, ranked at or very near the bottom of the global index for human development. Now put that country through 30 years of successive civil conflict that saw the destruction of virtually every meaningful institution, and then increase its population in a span of 6 years by 20%. I would propose to you that if we increase the population of even a developed nation, like France or the UK, by 20%, how would they be able to handle it? Frankly, it would be chaotic. But in Afghanistan, the lack of public administration and lack of effective governance has allowed that to happen. And so what we're seeing in Afghanistan in regards to refugee reintegration is the stresses and strains of a government that is sort of more or less buckling under the strain of reabsorbing the millions of people who have come back. So for the refugees who have come back, reintegration in Afghanistan is a serious challenge. For some, they have more or less been able to resume their lives in a relatively settled fashion. But for many refugees, they continue to face the lack of basic social services, foremost among those land, shelter, jobs, and then water, education, and access to health facilities. I believe that the era of spontaneous voluntary return is over. We saw 5 million people coming from since 2002. Last year, 280,000 Afghans returned home. This year, a fraction of that, only 50,000. And the reasons for that have to do partly with the low absorption capacity in Afghanistan, partly with security, particularly the refugees who are in Pakistan, who originate from the Pashtun belt, and who have concerns about returning to the place of origin where the insurgency activity is very strong. Part of it has to do with lack of employment opportunity. This is particularly the case with the refugees in Iran, who have relatively better living conditions and where there's, in Iran, they've been able to make a life for themselves. So 2.6 million Afghans still remain abroad, 1.6 million roughly in Pakistan and 1 million in Iran. And it is far from clear whether or if they will return from Afghanistan. As I said, to Afghanistan. As I said earlier, 80% of those refugees who remain abroad have lived there for more than 20 years. They no longer feel like Afghans for many of them. They feel no personal kinship with Afghanistan. They don't dress like Afghans. They don't speak like Afghans. And the idea of uprooting their lives and resettling to a remote region in the country is not particularly attractive to them. So it's a major challenge for the government of Afghanistan, for UNHCR, and the governments of Pakistan, but particularly with Iran, to negotiate and to come to a resolution as to the ultimate fate of the refugees. As far as the increased number of refugees, we are seeing far more displacement than we were a few years ago. We have over 250,000 Afghans who are displaced. And the reasons for displacement within Afghanistan have to do partially with the conflict, particularly in the south and the southeast, where again the insurgency is strong. But part of it has to do also with land dispute, with lack of economic opportunity, and so on and so forth. So for the foreseeable future, I think this will be a challenge for UNHCR.
One of the more interesting parts of the challenge, or the results, I should say, in Pakistan was you had about 80% of the internally displaced people who were displaced because of the military conflict in places like the Swat Valley and other places, is you had about 80% of those internally displaced people go into homes. People would take them in based upon both, I think, Pashtun tradition and the welcoming way that they bring people into their homes, and secondly, because of the experience of the 2005 earthquake. So you had, of the 2 million plus in Pakistan who were displaced, 80% of them were brought into homes. So maybe the the challenge there was a little different than it might be in other places, including Afghanistan. But I know we don't have a lot more time. But General, the last question, then we'll wrap up. And you may not have an opinion about this yet because it's about 24 hours. As we do in Washington, we want opinions on something that's barely out. But the administration has put forth now a draft, or at least a starting point on metrics, what they call evaluating progress with regard to Afghanistan, both military and non-military. I know you may not have had a chance to review it yet, but what's your sense? Do you have an opinion on what they've produced? And if not, what's your sense of how we should go about that? Because we need people that have the kind of experience you have to weigh in on what metrics are valid, what metrics are ones that we should use. And we have to have, I believe, we meaning the Congress, the administration, both, have to give a lot of frequent reporting on progress if we want to sustain support for any kind of an effort.
Thank you, Senator. I have not seen the metrics. I know that it's been a work in progress for some time. I am a strong supporter of metrics. What we have done to date, in my judgment, has been measure performance. How many miles or kilometers of road, how many children are in school, how many vaccinations. But we haven't measured the effect of the performance. And these metrics have to go to the next step. What is working? How do we measure it? Do we measure what we can measure because it's easy to measure, even though not relevant, or do we measure what's important to determine the effect? And then reinforce success, stop failure, and find something else. NATO has struggled with this. They're still working on it. The ISAF forces are working on metrics. I think we need to pull together some good analytical minds and critically determine what it is we'll focus on, both in security, governance, and this development process. They all bleed over into each other's field. You can't get one without the other. So I will be looking for this closely. I think that it will behoove us in the coming very near term here to come to grips with this. The hard part will be going out, getting the data, and then the critical objective analysis.
I hope all four of you will weigh in on that as time goes by. We need your help. Thanks very much. This hearing is adjourned unless Senator Kaufman has something else. We're all set? Hearing adjourned. Thanks, pal. Yeah.
So rather than David, it's having people talk about the U.S. detective about what everyone has in that field. Like we said,
With what?
Said research.
Right.